Welcome to what is intended to be the first lesson in Business Math Basics. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about whole numbers and fractions. And I was talking to someone the other day about this lesson I was putting together. I said whole numbers and fractions, and they said, "What? That's fourth grade math." Well, maybe it is, but at my age, I don't remember anything about fourth grade. So maybe you have my problem, or maybe you just weren't paying attention in fourth grade, or you just need a refresher. So this is the starting point to Business Math Basics. We're going to be talking about whole numbers and fractions. I'm guessing that much of what we're going to be doing in this lesson is review, and that's okay. It doesn't hurt to have a refresher on things. But the first concept we need to remind you of is a whole number. And a whole number is something that you learned even way before fourth grade. You learned it probably in kindergarten, and you learned it by counting. Whole numbers are just exactly what you learned in kindergarten: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But a whole number is also 1,000, 1,500,000. There's no decimal point attached to the number, and there's no fraction. And so whole numbers are something that we'll be working with in business math. Again, we're starting out real basic here, but the numbering system that we work with is the decimal system. That means everything is based on tens. And so think about it. When you learn to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, there's actually 10 digits. Also, think back to when you learned about numbers. You learned that there were columns. The first column to the far right was the ones column, and you had digits 0 to 9 there. And when you needed a second digit, you moved over into the tens column. When you needed a third digit, you moved over into the hundreds column and the thousands column. Everything is increased by 10. And so the number 123 would be 3 ones, 2 tens, and 1 100s. Continuing to review here, remember when we're working with large numbers, we separate the thousands, or each three digits, with a comma, as you can see with the example that's shown on the screen here. Well, it's time to talk about fractions. Fractions represent a point between two whole numbers. As you can see on the ruler here, we have many points between the 0 and the 1, or the 1 and the 2. And the difference between 1 and 2 is going to be a fractional amount of a whole number. Continuing to review our terminology here, mixed number. A mixed number is a whole number and a fraction attached to it. So you see on the screen here 4.5. 4.5 is a mixed number. It's a whole number and a fraction. Well, we're getting ready to do some math with our fractions. We're going to be adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing. But we need to remind ourselves of two different terms again: numerator and denominator. So the numerator is how many. The denominator is how many parts it takes to make a whole. So for instance, if I have a fraction of 1/2, that means I have one of the two parts needed to make a whole. If I had 1/10, it would be one of the 10 parts needed to make a whole. Numerator on the top, denominator on the bottom. Well, we're going to start by adding fractions. And in order to add fractions together, we must have a common denominator. In other words, we can't really add 1/3 to 6/8. We need to have the bottom number, how many pieces it takes to make a whole, in common. We'll talk about how to actually come up with the common denominator, but once we have that common denominator, it's really easy just to add the numerators together, and the common denominator stays in common, and that is how you add fractions. But let's go through an example so this will make sense here real quickly. Okay, let's start with a really simple example. We're going to add 1/4 to 1/2. Now, the first thing we have to do is find a common denominator because they're not the same. 2 and 4 are not the same. So we look for something that are multiples of 2 that are also multiples of 4. So multiples of 2 are 2, 4, 8, 16. Well, guess what? We hit the number right there with 4. So in this case, the 4 can actually be a common denominator. So we're going to convert each of these fractions into the common denominator. Okay, we determined that the common denominator is going to be 4. So we have to convert each of the fractions into the denominator of 4. Well, 1/4 is already there, so we do 0 with it, nothing at all. But in order to convert 1/2 into fourths, we have to multiply both the denominator and the numerator by 2, excuse me. And so we would end up then with 1/4 plus 2/4. So once we have that done, 1/2 plus 1/4 equals 1/4 plus 2/4, and we add the numerators together, 1 plus 2. We leave the denominator alone of 4, and so we end up with 3/4. Well, adding and subtracting fractions are actually very easy once we have the common denominator. And the same is going to be true if we're going to subtract fractions. We must first end up with a common denominator. So let's step through an example on the next slide and see how that works. Okay, let's take a very simple example for subtracting. We're going to take 1/3 minus 1/12. Again, they don't have a common denominator, so we need to find multiples of 3 that are also multiples of 12. So we start with 3, 3, 6, 9, 12. Whoops, there we got it. Of course, I made these very easy for the video here. So our common denominator is going to be 12. So we're going to have to multiply 1/3 by 4 for both the numerator and the denominator. And so we would end up then with 4/12 minus 1/12. So we subtract 1 from 3 for the numerators, and we then end up with 3/12. Now, typically, we want to convert these to the smallest denominator possible, and so we would do that by making this final answer be 1/4. Well, that concludes our very basic refresher from fourth grade math on working with fractions, but getting us ready now for business math basics. And hopefully you enjoyed this, and you'll potentially subscribe or at least watch some additional videos as we get a little bit more complex in our business math. We're going to be talking about working with interest rates and also working with percents. And remember, you can find all of my videos in one place on YouTube, of course, but you can also find them on my website, luthermaddy.com. And I will also have some written instructions and some cheat sheets, if you will, out on my website, again, luthermaddy.com. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it.